Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. We'll try and find out the reasons behind the present economic crisis and, of course, the way out for the Indian economy. And joining me in the program is Professor N.R. Bhanamurthy from the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, Mr. K.G. Narendranath, the Deputy Editor with the Financial Express, and the Dean with Jindal School of International Affairs, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. Now let us here also talk about the global factors, Dr. Chaulia, which the Prime Minister had referred to even yesterday and today. That is, they are leading to the rupee slide. This problem is not just limited to India. There are some other countries also that are facing the similar kind of problem. In fact, we did celebrate the time when Indian economy was going through a process of slowdown where the other economies were really facing recession. What would you like to say about the global factors here?
Yeah, it's an integrated capitalist world system of which there are so many units. India is one. So, and we have seen in the last 5 years that there's a bit of, double paced or even triple paced growth and declines happening in different regions. So, and you don't have simultaneous growth everywhere. So what usually happens, if you remember 2008 onwards, as you mentioned, the BRICS and the other emerging economies were still galloping, on average 6, 7, 8%, while the advanced economies were in a comatose condition. And now, especially over the last 6 months, there's some sense of maybe, the beginning of the end of the crisis for the advanced economies. Definitely not the end. So what that has done is it's created all these huge expectations, and particularly driven by energy. I mean, this is one sector, which is actually a positive sign for the United States, because they are becoming more and more self-reliant through shale gas. So that is, going to create a kind of a momentum where investors around the world are going to vote with their feet and think about safety, one, in times of turbulence. Because the US is the global reserve currency, in times of crisis people rush for it. Secondly, some so-called fundamental shifts, especially in the energy field, are giving people hope that maybe manufacturing will revive in the United States in the long run. Because even though the short-term interest rate, the current interest rates in the US have not particularly risen very much, the talk and the anticipation of it is pulling people back in the hope that, in the long run, maybe these emerging economies, developing countries, we have a certain set of problems which have always, if you look at, for example, a lot of, if you take out China from the BRICS group, most of the other countries don't have scored particularly highly in the ease of doing business index of the World Bank. So, although, the left in India says we are going neoliberal and all that, the reality is that if you understand what neoliberal is, where, it is very, very market friendly, it's never been. Neither our society nor many of the BRICS countries. So investors are always wary of this kind of, what they perceive as a hostile or a difficult environment. So now, on top of it, the speculation about the easing of the stimulus, what they call the tapering, it's become like a tsunami, and it's just sucking back capital towards the United States. The Europeans are also not in particularly great shape. Although they're saying that after some dozens of quarters, finally they're going to see some kind of positive growth, which is meaningless if it's less than 1%, but nonetheless. So it's about who owns capital in the world economy, and where are they taking their money. And Prime Minister said, barring capital controls, we'll try to do everything else. But if you see the Chinese, the Chinese have the ability to impose greater capital controls, and to an extent China has been the exception so far, although they have seen some 5-6 billion leave in the last 1 month or so, but nonetheless it's not a rout where they're, it's not a total flight of capital. So I think we have some lessons to learn from the more successful ones, but again, structurally speaking, we are in a different situation from the Chinese. We don't have the forex reserve, we don't have the huge trade surpluses which they have. So we are, in a sense, vulnerable. And my argument has always been that, when you talk about emerging economies, we should have fostered a, greater joint front and engaged in currency swaps and other kinds of stabilizing arrangements amongst us to free ourselves from the, yoking to the dollar. Because most of our currencies have been suffering from long-term depreciation against the dollar. and we need to have checked that. And I think this should be a wake-up call. Because apart from the firefighting they're doing now, with interest rates and with fiscal policy, in the long run at the international level, we'll have to think about new regional and interregional structures that can shield us from, the vagaries of Wall Street and the investors. Because if we say that we are a rising power, what does it mean that we are actually at the mercy of the whims of these, people with money who are willing to come in and go out whenever they want?
Now let's, Dr. Chaulia, again talk about the way, the countries are really responding to the present crisis. Because, some countries have a different way of reacting to such kind of crisis. In India specifically, it's a little difficult task. There are, in fact, legislations which are a century or maybe half a century old, which are now being amended or which now needs amendments. And there are different stakeholders, not just the corporates, but also the different political parties representing different regions and different sentiments and states, as well as this consensus between the state and the center, which in itself becomes, again, a very important thing. How do you look at the Indian economy still surviving and, facing all those things, coming globally or from within, and really standing there? Of course, the measures that are being taken, we are talking about that. But what would you like to say about the strengths of this economy?
Well, demographics, definitely. We are supposed to be young. Average age is what, in the early 20s, right? So that's going to stand us in good stead in the long run. But coupled to that, of course, is the cliche of the demographic curse. I mean, if we don't generate the skills and raise the, human capital base, then of course we have a volcano, right? With so many young people who are jobless and so on, and in the informal sector. So that will stand out. And there are, in fact, a few people, investors including, who have not, panicked and packed their bags and run away, because they are, they have this longer-term horizon in mind. And in fact, a lot of the emerging economies tend to be territorially as well as population-wise fairly large in size. So that means that in the long run, they can bounce back. They've made mistakes along the way, quite a few. And I think this is a time for, in a way, it's a sobering time for all of us, because we've been on steroids for too long, thinking that, now the global south is rising and power is shifting from west to east and all that.
That's right, yeah.
But it's, in a way, it's also a reality check that maybe we overdid this whole celebration of emerging economies, and now they need to look inwards as well as among themselves, as I said before.
And how serious do you think that the rating agencies, especially the international rating agencies, and their outlook of Indian economy or the others should be taken up?
Well, that's the reason, when Prime Minister says we won't impose capital controls, it's all with an eye on, to avoid junk status in ratings. And I think our ability to use, to channelize our domestic savings has been rather poor. That's why, people are buying gold rather than, So I think so where we need to think about as, collectively, emerging economies, is also, there are frontier areas like Africa. If you look at it, Africa is growing faster than us on average, and it will continue to do so. It has an even younger demographic, 19 years, something is the average age in Africa. It has the minerals, it has the agricultural resources, and there are many people talking about how, so trade, that's one area. If you see, we are a net deficit country in foreign trade. If we had a surplus, we would not be, hanging out our hats for foreign investors like this. So that's one big area where we need to really, really boost exports. And Prime Minister has mentioned that. But then, if we have not a world-class manufacturing base, what are we going to export apart from the services? And we know the service exports do not necessarily benefit average people in our country. It has a particular class dimension to the benefits that, and it's more skewed. So then the question is, semi-skilled and low-skilled workers, which are majority of our workforce, how can they benefit? So we will need to participate in a lot of these preferential trading agreements. We already do quite a bit. We will have to, do many more in time to come. There is a talk of a regional economic comprehensive partnership with Chinese as well as many other economies in the region. So we'll have to rev up many of these trade agreements. I think trade is one way in which we could possibly escape this vicious circle in the long run. And the other thing, of course, is I think some countries, if you see, we've not been able to persuade the Chinese to import more of our products. As you know, it's been an ongoing process. We still have some $35 billion deficit, and overall we are in deficit. So that's where the diplomacy comes in. Outward investment, yeah, there are a lot of flows going out, but it's not necessarily also bringing back. I think remittances are probably more beneficial to us than the outward FDI, and the supposed benefits brings back to us eventually. So even though there is a net outflow, we'll need to think about how it can also bring back some of the wealth and the opportunities and the skills to our own people. So, you know, we have to think really. I think one of the problems is until 2009, there was this commodities super cycle, and many of the emerging economies benefited from that. And we also went along with it because, of course, we are not major exporters of metals or anything. But nonetheless, it looked like, you know, we were all shining together, and our domestic consumption was going. So we didn't really look at the fundamentals. That's why, you know, I totally agree with the co-panelists when they're talking about structural reforms. Many countries have failed. Let's not be self-flagellationist to the point where saying India is somehow exceptional. Brazil is down to 0%. Brazil, which is supposedly the Latin American tiger, is down to 0% because they have also not done the structural reforms. And you saw those protests happening in Brazil recently. They're all linked to this general sense of despair that the emerging economy elites have really failed their people. And, you know, that's where, you know, the connect between the global economy and the domestic society, the intermediary is supposed to be the state. And you cannot, you know, discount the fact that there's been a general failure among many of the elites who have been engaging in crony capitalism, who have been engaging in monopoly promotion, and who have, in a way, artificially inflated our growth stories and our success stories. So I think we need to bring down our expectations, and we need to get down to the basics, and there has to be also popular pressure from below, like what we saw in Brazil, for moving the policies in a different direction.
Final comments from you, Dr. Chaulia. How do you look at the India's growth story now, and do you see it really recovering faster? And,
you know,
of course,
as I said before, the India story is part of a global economic crisis that is probably not even halfway through. So, for all we know, in a few months from now, the so-called expectations that have been set about a fast recovery in the United States and in the Eurozone may collapse. And these same money bags who are now leaving will come back. But what I've been arguing is that we need to be better prepared to handle them this time, and we have to have a stronger house in order to you know, checkmate some of their, you know, whimsical ways. And the other thing is, of course, to also have a, you know, a global level interaction, especially at the G20. We have a G20 summit coming up in 1 week, and this should be right up there. Whose responsibility is it? If the US Federal Reserve is setting off a panic all over the world, there must be some reprimand for what the United States do. They can't just say, you know, markets are free and we can't do anything about it. That's it's about responsibility, collective responsibility.
All right, so on that note, it's time here to say goodbye to all three of you. Thank you very much for joining.